All right, so section 3 is our interview with Bob Olhsson. Guys, I want to apologize that I think I had said it correctly and it glitched, but I could have said it incorrectly. But for some reason, the only video I captured was me. So I'll do something really kind of psychedelic with a still image and the video of me. And let's listen to the first half of the Bob Olhsson interview now. Normally with the podcast, I do like 2 cameras, so I'm kind of in the market for a couple of inexpensive webcams that I can plug both in at the same time and then live broadcast rather than do these pre-recorded.
I'd get a second GoPro.
Yeah. Yeah, Zoom makes one that's really inexpensive now, the Q2N, which is a good replacement for the GoPro, arguably better. Because GoPros are terribly expensive for what they are. Compared to like my little Sonys have wide-angle lenses, not as wide as a GoPro, but I think it gets a nicer picture, and I paid like under $200 for each one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. So
yeah, the advantage of the wide angle is that it holds focus better.
Oh yeah. Oh, everything's in focus. There is no shallow depth of field whatsoever. It's nice to pair it with the DSLR. So
that's what they use for the 3D stuff.
Yeah.
My stepson is a 3D, what they call a 3D engineer.
Really?
He's involved in aligning the angles on the 2 cameras. And they actually have to align these to the micron level. Oh. So every time they move the camera, they have to realign.
So he's just sitting out there with a caliper all day, checking the thing, making sure it's
so he's it's a computerized system, but he has to operate it and look at it and eyeball when it's right.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Which is real interesting. Although he says he thinks the reason 3D movies are working is not the 3D, but the fact that they can't use zoom lenses.
There's something to be said for that, right? Like 3D movies are more like a stage play.
Yeah, well, like a stage play or like a 1930s movie.
Exactly.
Where they want a close-up, you move the camera. You want a long shot, you move the camera back.
Exactly.
And he thinks that's a whole lot of what really makes it work. Because apparently they experimented with CGI. In fact, he thought he wasn't going to have much more work because everybody and their brother was bringing out CGI. And then lo and behold, they finally came to the conclusion that they have to do it the old manual way, and then they could use the CGI to reduce the picture for smaller theaters and smaller formats.
That makes sense.
But they have to start out with the maximum. So he's shooting IMAX 3D now, traveling all over the world.
Have you ever actually? I've never seen an IMAX film. I've seen a 35 millimeter film. In person, like on the projector, and the machine took up about this room. It was quite an impressive piece of equipment. I could only imagine what IMAX would look like because the film's twice as big.
Yeah, well, it's not film, it's video.
Oh, I guess it is all video now.
Yeah, it's all video, which for him it's kind of bizarre because it's like he's completely, I guess you would say, schizophrenic. It's like he's doing the IMAX 3D video, and he's one of the few guys left that can work as a camera assistant using film. And so
he's one of the few guys who knows how to do it.
Yeah, so he got a Woody Allen movie behind that a couple years ago.
That's awesome. That must have been a cool. That's got to be cool watching Woody Allen work.
I would imagine it is. I haven't talked to him that much about it, but he just finished Spider-Man, and then he did an industrial film for some Chinese company.
Oh man.
Can you imagine?
I can only imagine, like, only because I made a film and it went nowhere, right? But I've I've the YouTube stuff. I've been at it long. Like I was doing YouTube in college. I've just always had a weird passing fascination with film. Where really I'm an audio guy, but I can do video. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so,
Well, everything in audio came out of film.
right, right,
Something a lot of people don't realize.
right, and radio, like you had
And
mentioned earlier.
everything. Well, no, film came first,
Yeah, that's true.
and and what happens? The film adopted the actual origination of all this crap. Believe it or not, was PA systems,
Huh?
and
Yeah,
then they were using them in theatrical situation. One of the very first ones was in Radio City Music Hall
yeah, that's a tough room.
in the
If
early 1920s.
yeah,
And then from there, the movie guys went, well, gee, we would like to have sound. And so they worked that out. And a little bit, a few years later, the radio thing came up.
huh?
And it's real interesting. And the records actually, from what I understand, they didn't really adopt electrical recording until into the 40s because they felt that the acoustical
That's right.
sound,
They were.
sounded better.
That's right. Up until about the 1940s, they were still cutting to. They were cutting. They would record direct to disc,
Oh,
which
well, they were recording direct to disc until like 1950,
yeah,
early 50s. But I mean, going from a basically a weight and flywheel driven lathe
oh, okay.
doing not doing electrical, doing acoustic with
I
horns.
yeah.
That one really surprised me. It's like I mean, there was electrical recording because it had been developed for motion pictures,
Right.
electrical disc, before they did the sound on film thing. And then that company, oh God, I can't think of his, Pyral, Pyral in France invented the acetate coated aluminum disc. And a company in the US called Presto distributed them, and they very quickly became the standard in radio stations because radio stations wanted to be able to pre-produce parts of their programming and commercials and that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, because it streamlines production. Sure.
But records, interestingly, they were recording on wax into the early 50s because
Um,
the acetate only became practical when they came up with a stylus heating system to quiet it down.
that makes sense.
Before that, they had to use wax because otherwise it was just noisy as all hell.
Huh.
So they did wax, and then I'm not sure how they went about plating it, but I guess the same thing, spray it with silver
Yeah, that's right.
and the whole thing. But the history of it is really something I've been piecing it together over the last 15 years or so. And
Yeah, and I will tell you this: I had mentioned it today to a total stranger, and they're like, "When can I see this?" You, like, there's clearly a big demand out there for the history of it. Well, I guess it's the first next month or this month. I'm recording a guy named Paul Serrato. I don't know if you've ever heard his work or, but
that name sure sounds familiar.
yeah, he's a jazz musician from New York. He got started in the '60s, and he was admittedly the first professional musician I had ever met.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I was like 9, and he was really super encouraging, and here I am. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And we've kept in touch all these years, and yeah, he's coming down, and we're gonna record, and it's gonna be great. We're gonna do a lot of this, right, where we just sit around and chit chat and
What does he play?
piano, and he sings a little, and the way I got to know him was he was my neighbor. Her name was Lee Dratfield. She was a New York cabaret and Broadway singer. She was on the in the original cast of Cabaret, I believe. And she had retired and she had this weekend home in my neighborhood. So she'd come up every weekend. And I got to know her and she would bring all her friends from the city because I grew up like you're in Nashville, right? So I grew up in the equivalent of Franklin.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, Paul was the first one I ever met. I was like, I have a keyboard, and he showed me like left hand stuff. It was very, very cool. So it's gonna be great to get to hang out with him. But anyway, should we get started? We should probably get started.
Okay. Well, I thought we had. But...
Yeah, I did that to Ben Parker yesterday. I need to formalize it because I edited in, right? So it's like, where do you start? Where do you stop? You just want to know. So you're Bob Olhsson, the Bob Olhsson. Now, not everybody knows that. Like in the audio world, I don't know if you know this. You are a household name. You're spoken of in circles, in hushed tones, like, oh man, Bob Olhsson does this. It's great because you worked on some of the most important records in the history of American music. You worked at Motown. And so when you look carefully at the liner notes, your name comes up over and over and again. And it's very cool.
Oh, they've started putting it on.
Well, I'm not sure they're on the... I would have to...
We were almost everybody was uncredited because back then when you were recording a large proportion of the record live, at the end of an album, you would have 40, 50, 60 different musicians that had played on that album.
And I love pointing that out to the audience.
Yeah. On one tune or another. So, I mean, it was only after 16-track came in that they started sort of having one group of 5 or 6 guys, and then they'd give them credit. And that all started in the 70s.
So for anybody who watches this podcast who isn't familiar, we're talking about Motown. And Motown is like the model that I decided to try to model Get Off My Lawn Records after with an artistic tweak. Because the way we've been talking about this, the way I make records, I just put a band in a room and capture it because that's my thing. But Motown was very much a manufactured process, wasn't it? You were explaining to me it was pretty overdubbed.
Yeah. Well, we in many ways started all of that.
Okay.
And what it grew out of is that Berry Gordy, when he got out of the Army, he and a friend of his started a record store.
Okay.
They're both completely gone on progressive jazz. That bebop was it.
It is the bee's knees, after all. Yeah.
Yeah, it was what they wanted to do. And unfortunately, it was a complete commercial flop, and it wound up going bankrupt after about a year.
Oh, man. Well, we all learn a lesson, right?
That's the bad news. The good news is that Berry Gordy met. This was right at a time in the mid to late 50s. He and his partner served in Korea.
Okay.
To get a little bit of a idea of the time. So, like,
right.
I would imagine we're talking 55, 56, somewhere in there. And anyway, that's what they wanted to do. Their customers were all of the top radio and advertising musicians in Detroit.
That makes sense because the musicians go to listen to that stuff.
Because that was what the musicians were into.
Yeah.
And they also got to meet the local record distributors in Detroit. And at this time, see, Wall Street decided that records and radio and movies were all going away in the early 50s, it was all going to be replaced by television. That was the common Wall Street knowledge.
Okay, so all the money, so there was
And
not a lot of startup capital in this
so
area.
what happened was the record labels canned every artist that they didn't think could be a TV star.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So
And
then,
that meant most of the hardcore country, most of the hardcore R&B, the jazz,
right,
I mean all the stuff other than Crosby and Sinatra got thrown out of the majors.
and then here are all these that it kind of reminds me of the story of the Middle Ages where the troubadours came around all of a
Yeah,
sudden and
yeah.
displaced all of the
And so
minstrels.
here's all of these really good performers. So first off, you had that happen. Secondly, during World War II, we got the cream of Europe's musicians fleeing Hitler.
That makes it. Yep.
We also had the armed forces training tens of thousands of musicians for military bands and dance bands. The officers' clubs had dance bands, and they had marching bands and a whole thing. And so they would basically give music lessons, and they gave all of these guys instruments. And most of them could buy the instrument for next to nothing when they got out.
Right, because it's just military surplus at that point.
Yeah, so we had this incredible combination of music teachers and musicians in the United States after World War II that was just staggering.
Yeah.
It's really, it certainly is not worth a war to create that for
No.
the U.S., but that's what happened.
Right. Where
And
like today you would say the internet can bring the world's greatest musicians together, but in that post war era, it generated it just generated a huge influx of good musicians.
yeah, it generated a huge influx of good musicians and people. There was work for musicians. When I was in high school, it was not uncommon for high school combo musicians to be making $50, $100 a week playing a couple nights on the weekend.
Which is about what you make now. That's like
Yeah.
grown up. Yeah.
And that was like 1963, 1964. So
Right.
that $50 to $100 was worth 5 times or more as much as it is now.
Right.
And of course, the beauty of that is that meant that anybody with some real talent could think seriously about a music career.
Right. Where when I was growing up, and rightfully so for economic reasons, but it was not considered an appropriate thing to consider as a career. You maybe you study music in college, but you were expected to get a real job, and
Yeah, well, that was still the case then.
Really okay.
But if you were really dedicated, there was not basically, if you were really good,
Yeah.
you could earn a middle class living right out of high school playing music.
And you were telling me there was this great the history of public music schools where there's this whole generation of there's a great tradition in there with the teaching of jazz especially, and we really do keep it alive.
The black teachers
Yeah.
were powerful.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to have somebody who came out of that as a teacher, and I wish it was still taught that way. That was one class in school where how do you grade it, right? And all the others, all the rest of it, we would have a lot of focus on testing and all these things. You can't really test music. You can say, "Can you play it? Go ahead and play it." and that was it. And they just really understood how to get the most out of a student and get them practicing. That's the hardest part, is getting a kid to practice.
Yeah, just inspiration
Yeah.
and that whole thing.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
I didn't luck out with teachers quite that good, but in high school I had a guy who had been in the Army and played pop violin in country clubs.
okay.
And he was one of the people that I learned the most from.
So, so do you
He
still
was,
play fiddle?
he was Italian, and
Yeah.
no, I was never really any good.
Okay.
I mean, I just wasn't motivated. I would bounce between first and last chair of the second violin section, depending on if I felt like. I mean, I wound up taking a couple years of music literature in college, but that was because I had been hanging out in studios, and they told me that it would be a good idea for me to learn enough about music to be able to communicate with musicians.
That's a good idea. What did you study in college?
Music literature
You
and history.
That was what you majored in. That's a pretty good major. Yeah, that sounds like quite the rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, well, but I mean, I did about 2 years, and then I got the job at Motown, and it was like, this is what I'm going to college to get to, and here I am. So,
Gotcha.
so that was the end of that.
So look, how did you get the job? How did you get started at Motown, which went on to be one of the most important studios and labels in history?
Well, actually, I had been hanging out at the studio in Detroit called United Sound that was primarily an advertising studio, because back then, independent studios' bread and butter was advertising.
And there used to be a lot of work for it. Yeah, that was the case all the way up into the 80s.
And I mean, probably the first dedicated non-label owned independent record studio was Record Plant, New York.
Yeah.
Everything else, the bread and butter was the
Makes sense.
ads. I mean, that was really the deal.
So you're hanging out at United, right?
So I hung out there, and came up that I wanted a summer job.
Okay.
And so I was kind of feeling them out about getting one, but not flat out asking. And one of the guys, as a joke, sent me to Motown.
Really? Oh, yeah, just go over there. They're hiring.
I hear they're hiring. Go over there. That's what he said.
That's wild. Now I don't know that everybody in the audience has seen Standing in the Shadows of Motown, but I have, and everybody should see it. But I remember years ago, the way I came to get to know you was years and years and years ago. I was out of college, and I had just moved down here. I was probably down here about a year, and I had rented a commercial space to do work out of, right? Production and mixing and all these things. And I called you because I got to know you through the boards, and I said, "Can I pick your brain?" And you said, "Sure, here's my number," which, by the way, it's the nicest thing anybody could ever do. And so you had told me the way you had gotten into mastering was you had always had the nicest sound system out of everybody. And what was the system that you had when you first got started? What were you doing the original work on?
Well, what I first had was interestingly, I figured I'd rather have high quality mono than mediocre quality stereo. So I had a Macintosh 60-watt power amplifier, and I built myself a Dynakit preamp. And oh god, I think my first turntable was an AR.
Oh yeah.
And I think I had AR stereo amp was the first stereo amp I had, and a pair of AR3 speakers. But my first speaker was an Electro Voice 12-inch corner horn.
That makes sense, yeah. And I just remember coming out of that going, yeah, Bob can do it. Bob likes to listen to sound that's very, very high quality. I like to listen to sound that's very, very high quality. And you can hear, it's really the subtle differences. It's just having to be able to listen for that. But that takes years and years and years of experience to get any good at it. Because admittedly, some of them weren't great.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you're around. I mean, my other secret is I've always tried to be the dumbest, least experienced person in the room.
Oh, that's a good way of doing it. Yeah. That's true.
I mean, surround myself with people I can learn from. And I actually quit Motown 5 minutes after my boss quit.
Who was your boss at Motown?
Cal Harris.
Cal Harris. Okay. And what was that like? So you weren't the only engineer. There was a staff of engineers, right?
Yeah.
How many engineers were working at Motown at a time, give or take?
Well, we had 2 studios and we had 2 mix rooms, and we had 2 shifts in each.
In each.
Yeah. Basically a night shift and a day shift. And then the studios had usually one assistant kind of floating between the 2 studios, depending on what you were doing.
So it'd be an engineer and a shared assistant, and then the musicians on the session and the producer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the 2 studios were across town from each other, so it wasn't.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
See, I've only ever known about Studio A. How was Studio A? That was the one in the house, right? In the basement.
That was the original, and it was actually in a photo studio that was built behind the house.
Oh, okay.
It was originally a photo studio.
It's a great space to record in. It's a big empty room.
A big kind of empty room, and they originally tried treating it sort of like a radio station, and then ultimately, when it reached the point where RCA was pressing more of our records than their own, we were able to, as I understand the story, we were able to get them to do a room design.
Okay.
And so it's basically an RCA type room, the only real difference being that we didn't have the curved surfaces like they use.
Okay.
But their acoustician said he didn't think flat surfaces would really make that big a difference. So they're these kind of wedge-shaped. And the basic design of the studio is for it to be relatively dead at instrument level.
Okay.
Relatively live at ear-seated musician ear level.
Okay. Then
dead again at vocal singing level. So it's like a vertical stack.
Yeah. And yeah, that's a good way of approaching the room. I've always just gone for dead. I've never gotten.
And then the other trick is that they, in fact, they told our guys how to measure it and all. Yeah. It's designed to reflect a flat frequency response back.
Very cool. Yeah. So it's not altering the EQ of the room at all.
And so that meant that the bleed is just really clean.
Right.
And in that kind of a room, you can mic a singer from 3 feet away, and it'll have just as much presence as on top of the mic. Only it won't require any compression, because the inverse square law will help you with their head motion and all of that. Now, it turns out that's one of the big reasons that we need to compress vocals is
because the head moves around. Yep.
Because the head's moving around, and that close to the mic, the inverse square law just kills you.
Yep.
But if you as you move the mic back, less and less is required.
That makes sense. Yeah, this is This is the part I love, is going right into the details of it. But I also know that, like, in my community, I'm the guy, right?
Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
that
So
that
you
was an RCA design.
gotcha. How big would you say the space what was, give or take?
God,
Yeah, that's okay.
it's been a while. I mean, there's a bunch of pictures of it around. You can see
Yeah.
it's a 9-foot piano,
Oh,
so you can kind of calculate it from that.
yep. And I think it's a museum now. I think you can actually go physically pace it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but that's so what a
They're
back
now
then you were
making
recording
Record Plant Sausalito a museum.
really?
Yeah, I hate the idea of studios becoming museums.
Yeah. Yeah. That part's tough. I think that there's probably a happy medium where um they should have people who have historically worked in the room should still have access to the room to get to do like public works and things or something, but yeah, it's tough because capitalism kind of pushes them into museums after a while, cuz Motown moved from Detroit to LA at one point.
Yeah,
And
they had to.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, what happened was
yeah,
in the
why did it
late,
have to? That's the part I guess I don't understand.
in the late 1960s, all of New York and Chicago moved to LA.
Oh, that's when the migration happened. Okay.
And basically, you see, you have to understand Motown was a management company that had a record label. It was a management and publishing company that had a record label.
Yeah, you were telling me that where
And so, in order to manage the artists, Barry had to be able to meet with people and have interactions with them. And it was a couple hour plane ride from Detroit to Chicago,
I
and,
imagine more
and
than
a couple 3 hour ride to New York.
yeah.
So he could manage artists out of Detroit if everybody he was dealing with was in New York and Chicago.
But once they started coming out of LA, you had to go.
But the minute it all moved to LA,
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of London moved to LA. I mean, it was real bizarre.
Yeah. Well, we're
And
kind of watching that happen here in Austin too. That's kind of what's going on out here. Is there's just people coming all over the place. Nashville's growing too, isn't it?
not music.
No, not in music. Not in
No,
music. Not
it's
in Austin
growing.
either.
It's growing in computer programmers.
Yep.
And the great irony in Nashville is that these people are not working for local companies and can live anywhere.
Yep. This sounds exactly like Austin.
And so as the real estate prices go up, the incentive for them to move here goes down.
Yep.
And a whole bunch of developers are going to lose their shirts because they don't understand that there are not local jobs that pay the kind of money to pay for living in these places.
Yeah. It's a little weird out there all over the place these days.
It's getting real interesting because I mean the real estate people are really seriously out of touch with what's going on.
Which resembles 2007. Yep.
And I don't know what I don't know where it's all going to go, but it's like right now it's this big bubble is building up,
Yeah.
and at some point, I mean, Nashville and Austin are both hip, relatively inexpensive college towns.
Yep.
I mean, that's their appeal. The programmers can move in, meet women,
And then move
party.
away. Yeah.
It's a cool thing. But the minute the price gets up to a certain point, it isn't going to be that much less expensive than living in the San Francisco area where the jobs are.
Yep.
And so it'll come down to, well, you can live in San Francisco, or you can go way out in the sticks to where it's less expensive.
Yep. And that's been going on. I remember first hearing about super commuting about 10 years ago at this point, where people were getting pushed out of their neighborhoods and they would wind up moving like 90 minutes outside of the city they were working in, and they'd have to get up and drive 90 minutes each way.
Yeah.
It's just a strange time. But
now with the internet, you don't have that. With the internet, you have people able to work around the world from where their employer is.
right, and when you see all the programmers, like you said, they all move into the same neighborhood, it's really because there's good connection speeds. The real big driver in terms of economics for real estate values these days is a internet connection speed. If all you can get is satellite connection, the land is almost worthless out here.
Yeah, well, that's probably true. We have fiber to the house here.
Oh, I'm jealous. I only get cable.
Yeah, no, AT&T, Google
Oh,
started to move in with the fiber. AT&T turned around and went, oh,
we're gonna have to do fiber.
so we have gigabyte fiber in our whole neighborhood with AT&T,
That's crazy. So
and it's crazy.
because
For $7 a
in
month.
town though, right? You're not like out in the suburbs.
No, I'm right in West Nashville.
Oh, okay. Yep.
I'm right, I don't know, a couple miles from Vanderbilt University.
That's a nice area out there.
Yeah.
It is pretty out there. And those mountains. All those mountains. So you would work the engineers would work 2 shifts at Motown making music. How many records would you work on in a year then, doing that kind of work? Just as one of them.
A lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I could imagine. And what
And we had Cal, basically, he came to Motown from Gold Star in LA. And before that, he had been at United Western,
okay.
which is where he started.
That
I mean,
makes
he actually started assisting on the Beach Boys.
There's a place to get started.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know that until I got the Pet Sounds box. There was his credit on Good Vibrations, and I called him up, asked him, hey, what's this?
He's like, oh yeah, I remember that gig. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you told me this
So
story.
anyway, I got the ultimate education, because what happened was our top production team, Brian Holland, Lamont Dozier, and Eddie Holland,
Okay.
quit. They thought they weren't making enough money. They'd gotten the biggest checks BMI had ever written, but they didn't think they were making enough money.
It's a free country.
And so they split and took 2 or 3 of the recording engineers with them. And they needed somebody in the studio bad. They knew I had some music experience, so I basically was told to train my replacement in the cutting room and dragged into the studio.
So that's how you started, though. You started in the cutting room. You would edit the front and back of stuff for mastering,
and cut acetates.
You were cutting. So you started by cutting acetate. That's wild.
I started by cutting. Yeah, which is interestingly exactly how it worked at the majors and how it worked at Abbey Road. And I mean, that was the pattern. Was you started out there simply because if you screwed up, it wasn't that costly.
Right. I mean, acetates are
whereas
expensive.
when you got 10 musicians getting paid union scale out in front of the mics,
it's extremely expensive.
Screw-ups are extremely expensive.
Yeah.
And so that was the pattern back then.
Yeah.
And and plus it was important to know what could go on vinyl and what couldn't, and have a pretty good idea of what was going on with all of that.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So anyway, I got hauled out of my little nerd heaven and thrown in the studio and given a crash course by Cal Harris and by Joe Atkinson, who had come to us from Atlantic Records in New York.
Very cool.
And we still had a couple of the Motown guys around, and so I was able to learn from them also. So I basically got the ultimate graduate school in recording engineering, although I didn't even know it until some of it years later.
That makes, yeah, I could imagine. Yeah, like I've always had to learn by failing at it, but you got tutelage from some of the greatest names in the history of music. That's wild.
Yeah, well, I couldn't afford failure.
Right.
So,
do you remember what was the first session you worked on in Motown? They train you. They say, "All right, have at it." Who was the band? Well, we know who the band was. What was the song?
I did mostly vocal overdubs and comping for the first year in the studio.
So they would have somebody else record the Funk Brothers, and then they would.
Well, the way it worked was the rhythm sections were recorded in Studio A from 10 in the morning till 6. I think it was 10, 11 to 12 to 1, 2 to 3, 4 to yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean 2 3-hour union sessions.
Oh, okay, I get you. Yeah, so you're doing 2 sessions,
and there was hell to catch if you didn't get 4 tracks in each of those sessions.
So that was the expectation: is you put a bunch of the finest musicians ever in a room, hand them charts. You get 3 hours to record 2 songs.
Record 4 songs.
Oh, okay. So you had to, in the course of a day, you'd actually finish 8 songs, or the beds for all.
Hopefully, yeah.
8 songs in one day. That's about the speed we work at. Yeah, that's it's an intense session. But
yeah.
But I'm pretty sure those guys.
So we would do that, and then I would do, and then at 6 o'clock I'd come in, and we'd be doing vocals
with the artist.
Yeah, with the artist and with backup singers.
So who was the first one? Who was the one where you were like, "Oh God, I got to push record on the tape machine now"?
I have no idea.
That's awesome. Who was your favorite?
Oh, Levi Stubbs of the Four Tops.
Levi Stubbs, yeah.
Now, Levi and Gladys Knight were more or less our 2 best singers.
Yeah, I'd agree. Though I love Marvin.
And Levi was especially interesting because he could stand there and out-sing himself all night.
Huh.
I mean, it was literally about when the producer just couldn't take anymore. Go home, because they knew the next take would be better. And it would always be better. It was really funny.
And yeah, if you're working with tape in 3 hours, were you trying to get the same 8 songs done in a 6-hour vocal session, or what was that like? What was that process looking like?
Well, we were trying to get whatever the producer wanted to get done, which probably more like 2 or 3 songs.
2 or 3 songs. Okay, that makes sense.
And Motown, I believe, may have been the first place to actually be capable of punching in to record.
So you did a lot of punching. So you guys were the first to start doing that. Punching in, just so everybody knows, is when you're running along on tape and you're listening, and you interrupt the listening and you replace it with whatever's going on right in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we actually were. I haven't seen any. I know that they built the system to do that for a 3-track machine.
So you back in those days, you were working on 3 tracks?
No, by the time I got in there, we were doing 16.
16 tracks. Okay.
Yeah, my first thing outside the cutting room was mixing 8-track stuff, like TV tracks and
right.
Relatively unimportant, low
profile stuff.
Low Well, low. What's the word I'm looking for? Low deadline.
Gotcha. Yep. Because
And then from there, I went in the studio and I worked 6 to 2 for about a year and did probably the vast majority of Motown's vocals in that period.
that's great. So my favorite of the Motown of everything Motown ever did was What's Going On with Marvin Gaye. You pressed record for those sessions.
Some of them, yeah.
What was that like? Because that was the protest record. Did you get? I mean, was there
Well,
even a sense of
Marvin was real into punching.
Okay.
So that was all recorded phrase by phrase.
Phrase by phrase.
And he couldn't decide how he wanted to phrase some of it. So we did a couple different versions on different tracks. This was 16 track.
So you'd have like a stereo music bed, and then you get 14 different tracks
And
you could punch into.
and then he would we'd wind up with maybe 2 vocal tracks
Okay.
punched down, and then he'd take that home and study it and try and figure out how he wanted to put those together. And that was more or less where the idea, when he couldn't make up his mind, he said, well, put them both in. And that's how
where that sound came from.
That's where that multiple vocal thing came from.
And that is really the highlight of that record for me too. What was Marvin like? Because you're one of these guys. You were in
it would vary. It would vary.
Really?
He would be kind of moody. I mean, the context of that record was he wanted to produce himself.
Okay.
And they wanted him to first prove he could produce, giving him this group called the Originals.
Right.
And somebody pitched, Obie of the Four Tops pitched What's Going On to him for that Originals record.
Okay.
And his wife apparently told him, hey, you really ought to do that song. And so he booked the session to do the song and didn't call the group.
And so you come in and you're like, so where's the Originals? And he's like, no.
And I wasn't on, I don't think I was on that first one.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And so it was a sort of a renegade thing.
There were the stories about how like Berry Gordy didn't want any of the musicians playing on anybody else's records but Motown records.
Well, no, he was paying them $500 a week on top of union scale to not play on other label stuff.
Right, and then you pay a couple of, and then they wouldn't listen. They would still go play on other stuff, but they would go on.
So yeah, but that was the reason was not that he was holding them back. I mean, $500 a week was a lot of money in the mid '60s.
Huge amount of money. Well, he knew.
And then union scale at that time was $60 an hour.
Okay, and so you would do.
And they would be doing like a couple sessions a day.
Yeah, so you make about 120, or you make 180. That's good money. Yeah, you'd make $400 or $500.
Yeah. They were among the highest paid musicians in the world. And Standing in the Shadows of Motown really tried
talk about that.
Make a drama about it. And so the reason they would come in and, the reason they didn't want them playing on, obviously from a creative standpoint, they didn't want them playing on other records, but they were paying them to not play on other records.
Right. Like, come on, guys, we're paying you good money. We're going to pay you extra good money.
And
we want exclusivity.
And it wasn't all of them. It was just some of them.
Oh, okay. It would be the guys like Jamerson and those guys. What was? Yeah. Did you record? So you did most of the vocals. Did you ever get to record the band?
Oh yeah.
What were they like? That must have been a pretty funny room.
Well, they were pretty wild. I don't know.
Yeah. I guess when you look at it, when you're in
James was a real character.
Yeah, I heard stories.
And which, I mean, some of the producers just couldn't handle him, and so they started putting Bob Babbitt on about half of the stuff.
And Bob is an excellent bass player in his own right.
Bob was incredible. He's why I moved to Nashville. Actually,
Is he out there too?
he was.
Oh,
He's gone. He's
that's
passed
right.
away.
That's right.
But yeah, he was here, and I got together with him for the first time since 1972, about 2001,
And you're like, let's go tear this town up. Let's. That sounds like a good time.
and he was starting a demo recording company with a drummer named Ed Green, who had played all the Barry White records.
Okay. Yep.
And so my wife was doing some songwriting, and we had this idea of, well, okay, we'll let these guys create some demos for her. And so we flew in here, and
It's quite a town.
and they were, well, it's quite the town, but I mean, these guys were beyond most of the town.
Yeah.
and,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we did it, and it was like, holy cow. And what had happened was that Bob had been playing with Brenda Lee on the road for a number of years, and she had quit the road.
Okay.
And so he was looking for work. And he and Ed Green were Tom Bell's first call bass and drums. And so they had played a bunch of stuff together for that. And I don't know the details of Bob was a whole bunch of why Ed came here. And so anyway, we had the baddest ass R&B bass and drummer in the country sitting here hardly working. And my reaction was, holy cow, what an opportunity.
Right. Right.
And so we moved, and we also had reached the point where most music people couldn't afford to live in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And I was down to virtually none of my clients living there, and I knew people. I mean, anybody that bought a house in the 1970s was still okay, but anybody who hadn't bought a house like us,
It's time to go. Yep.
it was time to go. There was no, and I had kind of shifted off into doing post-production and mastering, film post.
Do you do a lot? How do you get started? I've done film post, but only on stuff I've made, right? Like, how do you get those? Well, I guess you're you.
Well,
You
United
get name recognition.
No, what happened was, I mean, I had learned some of the basics at United Sound because they were doing
Foley and
TV
stuff.
commercials,
Yeah.
filmed TV commercials. So I'd learned some stuff there, and I'd studied radio drama from the 8th grade through graduating high school.
Okay.
And my teachers were these two women that had gotten fired from NBC when the men came home from World War II.
Oh yes, that's right.
They cleaned out all the women, and so they were reduced to teaching drama in junior high and high school. But somebody or other had talked them into putting studios in the junior high and the high school and doing a radio drama class.
It's not a bad thing to do. My high school had a television production class. Yeah.
And so my first teachers in this stuff were these two women.
Okay.
I mean, the first microphone I ever worked with was an RCA 44.
Oh. Those are hyper expensive now too, which
and they had a little 4-channel RCA mixer and a Presto tape recorder.
Oh wow.
And so, I learned a little bit about editing and how to use microphones and how to make scripts not make a lot of noise, which is a totally lost art.
Yeah, because I don't know how to do it.
And, well, they would type it on a sort of a tissue paper.
Oh, okay.
And you were using a figure eight mic. So when you came to the end of a page, you would just let it drop on the floor, and it would be off axis to the mic, and the tissue paper wouldn't make a crackly sound or anything. So
Yeah.
that's how all the old radio dramas were done.
Yeah, that's pretty. Have you heard? Have you
And
heard
they,
Eric Seraphin's thing? He did the. He turned all. I think he turned all of his books into radio. The Mixer
yeah,
Man Diaries. He turned into an
yeah.
audiobook. I was listening to that today,
Oh yeah,
and he's a hoot. Have you ever gotten to work with on anything he worked on? Have your paths
yeah,
ever crossed?
yeah. Oh yeah,
Yeah, he was. I
yeah.
don't
I
know.
met I met him at a party at the AES show in LA.
Oh, see, I've never been to the AES. I should go to the AES. That's where my people are.
And I think I was introduced by Harvey Gerst or Dan Schwartz, one of them. Anyway,
Yeah,
people I knew from online.
yeah. And what's so are you doing primarily major label mastering then? Is that your bread and butter these days?
I'm primarily doing indie American and small label European
Oh,
master.
really?
Yeah,
Yeah, that would make sense since the big Americans are chasing the new whatever. But yeah, the indie cuz I don't think I've ever heard anything you've mastered that had anything that ever jumped out at me, which is the goal of mastering. You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like I've
Get out
never
of the
went,
way.
what in the world was that? And look in it's your name, which I can't say for everybody. But
Yeah, well, I was in San Francisco. I wound up, a bunch of my friends were not happy with what was happening with their digital masters.
I don't blame them. Yeah.
And so that was kind of how I wandered back into it. And my work with the band, I worked for 10 years building a studio and recording Quicksilver Messenger service.
Really?
Yeah, so that was how I spent the 80s.
That's not a bad way to spend the 80s.
And then in the 90s, that all capital blew up, and we basically got completely screwed by the hitmen.
Well, that's totally out of context because Eric used to work at Capitol, but I don't know about this. What do you mean? Can you?
Well, what happened was these guys were basically extorting record labels.
Who were who were
They
these
hit,
guys?
uh, I guess Morris Levy's the most notorious of them.
Okay.
In fact, some of them wound up doing prison time behind the whole thing. But
Was
but
that the
they would,
payola scheme or no? That was
yeah,
something else.
yeah. Well, it
Okay.
was extortion. I mean, it was like payola, but they basically, you had to, the radio station. I mean, the old description of payola, from what I've gathered, never existed to anywhere near the degree that people think.
Okay.
Because, I mean, think about it. A radio station is in the business of selling advertising.
Yes. So why would you give up the control of the content that keeps people there? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
basically, you could pay them off and get a few spins, but if those records didn't start flying out of the stores, you were off the air quick.
Pretty quick. Well, and that's the funny thing,
So there was an opportunity there. But what
Yeah.
happened with Levy was they would, I mean, the stations had moved in the 80s, the stations had moved over to focus group tests
Okay. Yep.
and away from record sales determining what they were going to play.
I don't blame them. Yeah, because otherwise, because back in that era, you could manipulate it. Like Prince manipulated his way onto the Billboard chart at one point.
Well, I mean, to a certain degree, you could do that, but you could not get that far
Yeah.
doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, especially when record sales were
But the
higher.
problem with the focus group thing is that what people will react to may not be something that they would ever consider buying.
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas with the old way, if it was on the air for any period of time, it meant people were buying it.
Yeah.
So basically, the public were determining what was on the air.
Right. Like the labels, they may have paid the DJ to give it a couple spins, but then once people started calling in requesting it again, then
Yeah.
You see it a lot with YouTube these days. There's companies that pay for that initial push on virality, and I don't blame them for it. I've considered doing it myself.
Yeah. But I mean, that was kind of how it worked. Well, what these guys were doing is they would basically, if stations picked up your record, you had to pay them to keep it on the air.
Yes, that is absolutely extortion. Yep. Oh, we played it for you.
And the way the scam was working was the label would basically give the artist the money to pay them. And then they were kicking some of the money back to the label presidents.
Right. So they would the station would actually demand it from the artist. The artist would say, "I can't pay that." The label would go, "Here, we'll recoup."
Well, not the station. This little cartel they had of research.
Right. But they would say, "All right, your record it's not going to do well unless you pay us." The artist goes, "I can't possibly pay that." They go to the label. The label says, "We'll pay it for you." And then they were given a kickback to the president. And then
well, what happened to us is our record came out, and a week later, the president of Capitol disappeared.
Really? Wow.
And we started getting these phone calls wanting to know where our money is.
Oh, man.
And we didn't even know what the hell they were talking about.
That's terrifying.
And by the time the thing was over, our record came out with Brian Wilson's reunion with the Beach Boys and with Paul McCartney's return to EMI.
All in the same week?
All in the same release.
All on the same release?
What
release was it?
Same day.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's what they were promoting was these oldies.
Yeah.
And McCartney made it up as high as 90-something, and we and the Beach Boys never charted.
Yeah.
Because we didn't, I mean, McCartney nobody had the money to pay him because the president of the label had been canned. I mean, there was some kind of a huge shakeup inside Capitol where they had discovered this thing.
I'm totally going to have to go start asking around and dig this up. I might do a mini documentary on this. This sounds super interesting.
But anyway, so we basically were screwed. And then the piece de resistance is that the former drummer in the group tried to sue us for using the name, even though he had signed the name off.
Yep. And so it just adds insult to injury.
And our guy couldn't find the release. He had 5 witnesses to it, but couldn't find the actual release. And then Capitol just dumped the whole thing.
Oh, and that's the tough part with big labels, isn't it? It's like...
Yeah, well, I mean, they didn't want to deal with it. And I mean, my own theory is that this guy had sold the use of the name to somebody else, because there was a bluegrass group and there were a couple others using the name Quicksilver.
Yep. I remember there was a band using the name Quicksilver back in the days of mp3.com.
And my guess is that somebody had put them in touch with him, and they'd cut a deal to let them use the name. And he didn't want to get found out or whatever.
Oh, that's frustrating. What
But anyway, that was 5 or 6 years work down the drain.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's why I like making records very quickly, like the Motown process. Just knock it out.
And so anyway, I wound up, a friend of mine's wife. This friend of mine was a sound editor,
Okay.
sound designer, big time sound designer, a couple Oscars, the whole bit.
Right.
And his wife knew that I had been playing with DigiDesign sound tools.
Right. Okay. This was back. Sound Tools is
Yeah.
what became Pro Tools.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so he thought, well, maybe we can adapt this to film and I don't have to cut mag film anymore.
Not a bad idea.
And so I went to work for him and learned more than you'd ever want to know about time code and all of that stuff. And we basically wrangled the sound tools and then later Pro Tools into working for picture.
So you would record you'd record like what were you running SMPTE? Yeah, I'm actually
Sound effects and the whole thing. Well, a friend of his had come up with the idea of using SMPTE to lock the picture.
Yep. Yep, that's how I would do it. I would have in that era before it was all built in. I would have
Yeah,
I would have striped a SMPTE to a digital.
Well, his friend literally invented that working method.
Really?
Yeah, he wound up starting a company called Compact Video in L.A. But anyway, they had met at Lucas.
Okay.
And anyway, ultimately what happened was the two of us walked the first DigiDesign system into Lucasfilm.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And did a picture and got the phone call. What the hell did you guys bring on the stage? Because they'd been using Synclaviers.
Right.
You know, $100,000+ production bottlenecks.
Yeah.
And we had this thing for way less money. And so we basically created our own demise, because ultimately what happened was everything moved to Los Angeles.
Yep.
Because in LA, a producer can go from 2 guys working on a film to 10 or 15 at the drop of a hat.
Right.
And they couldn't do that in San Francisco. They couldn't do that anywhere else in the world. And so the producers really wanted to work in LA because that gave them the backup. If something went wrong, they had to change a picture cut, and that just threw everything to hell.
Yeah, you really just want to be right nearby.
They could bring in a whole team, and the director could walk between 10 editing rooms.
Oh.
And straighten it all out.
That sounds nice.
And so to this day, half of Bollywood is done in parts of North Hollywood, and
yeah,
they're like little neighborhoods, and there's a whole thing. But that just completely demolished the amount of movie work going on in the San Francisco area.
Yeah, well, that and Vancouver came online, and so things that wanted that look could go to Vancouver, and admittedly Canadians were cheaper, at least back then.
Yeah, to a certain degree. But in this case it was more about being sure of hitting deadlines.
Yeah, and with film that's a big deal, is hitting that deadline.
Yeah, because God knows how many $1 million is going out the window on the date of that deadline, and so they jolly well better have the thing done. So anyway, it had come down to there wasn't much work left in the San Francisco area.
Yeah.
Doing film. There wasn't much happening with music. Our money was going out faster than it was coming in. I called friends in LA and in New York the guys in New York said, "Oh, gee, I'm getting calls from everybody in New York."
Right.
And so the whole thing was kind of melting down. This is around 2000, 2001.
Right
And
as I
so,
came online. Yeah.
and so we kind of looked at it and went, well, okay, my work's almost all from out of town, so I can be anywhere. I can rent anything I need in Nashville just like I would be able to in LA.
That's true. You have a very good network of
I don't have the
rental gear.
cost of living of LA yet.
Not yet. Nope.
And so it just seemed, well, okay, let's forget about film. Let's go back to music and do that. And so that's what we did.
That's very, very cool. What's your workload look like? How many projects do you take on a year these days? I imagine you're extremely selective.
Well, not super selective, but I think I've got one. I've got 3 that I'm in the middle of, and 2 waiting, and
Yeah.
it kind of drifts on like this.
That's a good place to be. I couldn't make it. Yeah, I came online. I tell the story. I'm that generation. I didn't know how to make records, and I didn't know a studio or anything. But I had bought a piece of software buying in a video game store called Magic's Music Maker, which I believe Magic's makes Sequoia.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah. I use Samplitude.
right. And here I am at like 14 with my computer, and I could record myself, and that's how I thought records were made. I had no idea. It took me 20 years to figure out to really grasp the history of how music has been made and what's lost. The thing I feel that we've lost in the last 20, 30 years is the big room.
Oh, the big room, but the big thing we've lost is the live gigs for the musicians where they learn how to perform.
Yeah, that's also true. Yep. And
I mean, when I go, okay, what's wrong with today? There's sort of 2 basic things wrong. Well, there's really one basic thing wrong, which is everything's all overdubs.
everything. Yeah,
And I have never heard anybody do an overdub that was as good as not an overdub, as they could do not doing an overdub.
right. Put everybody in a room and just do it right. Because you were telling me with the Motown days, the band, they would come in. So you try to get 4 songs recorded in 3 hours. So
Yeah, and they've never
for a
seen the
second
songs
take,
before.
how many takes of stuff would you do? It sounds like I would only be able to get 1 or 2 takes of everything done in that speed, I think.
Well, we'd probably get maybe 3 or 4 and a few false starts.
Yeah, okay. So everybody was working hard. That
Yeah,
sounds
pretty much.
That's pretty wild.
But I mean, they were really good, and we had arrangers. That's something else that's been missing in action for God.
What? A what? A ranger?
Yeah,
What is this? I'm not familiar.
an arranger is somebody who.
Oh, a ranger. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you said a ranger, like a park ranger. Yes, an arranger. There is nobody. It seems like today, if you're an enterprising young startup musician, you're combining the arranging with the recording with the writing, and those all used to be very independent jobs, and people put a lot of time and effort into each skill and developed them as individual skills, and we've lost that today.
Yeah.
And it drives me nuts. Arranging is what I studied in college. That was really my whole thing. I didn't go for engineering. I went to learn how to write charts and write jingles, actually. I really wanted to write jingles.
Yeah. Well, at Motown, we used something sort of halfway between a chord chart and they would write out little figures the arranger would basically get together with we had songwriter/producers.
Okay.
And so they'd get together ahead of time with the arranger, and they would have their ideas of little figures they'd like and this and that. And so the arranger would write that out for those instruments.
And then dump chords in the rest and go have fun, guys.
And then for everybody else, they would get sort of a glorified chord chart. And for the guitars, they'd hand them all to this guy, Joe Messina.
Yeah.
And he would basically look at the thing and point at each guitar player and say, you play this, you play this, you play that. So he was the guitar arranger.
Yeah, because it was what, about 3 guitars on every session in those records?
At least 3.
Yeah, and they were all playing really coveted instruments. Now, a lot of '60s Fenders and stuff.
Telecasters, and one guy played a Gibson.
Yeah, I think it was a 335. Yeah, I found it, like, one of the things I found with the Motown thing, I was surprised to find it was, because you were telling me with what's going on, you would record the band, and then the strings would have been recorded separately, and then you'd do vocals. Was that the overdub process?
Well, we did the vocals before the strings, but yeah.
Okay. Oh, you go sweeten it with strings. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you were telling me it took, what, 10 days or something after Berry Gordy signed off on the LP?
Yeah, well, basically, he got Marvin's contract called for him. He had to release a new single every so often, or Marvin was out of his contract.
Really? Now, when we say every so often, are we talking about months, years, weeks?
I don't know the details of it, but it basically came down to that was the only thing they had on Marvin to release.
Okay.
Which was kind of how Marvin had manipulated the situation.
He pushed it in. Yeah.
And Barry's problem, if anything, was that he liked it too much.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, remember the record store with the bankruptcy?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So his view was that he couldn't imagine Marvin's audience was mostly teenage girls.
Sure. Yeah.
And he couldn't picture them being into that song.
Right. And just for context, Marvin Gaye was kind of the Justin Bieber of his day.
Yeah.
And
so from Barry's standpoint, he thought, well, geez, we're going to spend a whole bunch of money promoting this thing. It's going to go nowhere unless Marvin basically is starting over with a new audience.
Right. That's right.
And that turned out to be correct.
Yep, because they went right after the college crowd.
But basically, well, they didn't go after anything. They just put the record out.
That's right.
And within a week, the thing was in the top 5. And the sales department goes, well, where's the album?
Yeah.
What album? And so the rest of the thing was recorded in about 10 days.
It blew.
Written and recorded in about 10 days.
Written and recorded.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think because I remember Nile Rodgers. Did you ever get a chance to work with Nile on anything?
Nope.
No. Nile Rodgers talked about I think they would record songs. They would do one song in a day, and in the late 70s, in the 80s, that was considered like a breakneck speed. Because I don't know what happened, but it seems like right around when Motown kind of declined, and then the concept albums really kind of came around.
Yeah.
The whole industry got really, really opulent. Like, I need 50,000 didgeridoos, like that. Granted, Brian Wilson had flashes of that, but that was the beginning.
Yeah, well, what had happened is that, actually, I think you can trace most of it to Mo Austin at Verve Records.
Okay, yeah.
He had figured out that if you could do a jazz album with 4 songs on it, and if the jacket was a gatefold that looked like a coffee table book, you could sell these things like hotcakes.
Yeah.
And then he wound up getting hired by Sinatra to run Reprise because he was the hippest guy. and then a bunch of stuff came together, and they wound up buying Warner Brothers out.
Oh, wow.
And so Austin wound up being one of the main kingpins at Warner Brothers.
Okay.
And this is what brought us all kinds of wild stuff. I mean, it was about selling albums.
Right.
And the other pioneer in that was Herb Alpert.
Yes. Herb Alpert does not get enough, love. He donated a huge amount of money. Like, most of his fortune that he made as a musician has gone to charity at this point.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Herb Alpert's a good guy.
That's what I understand. He was here in Nashville for a decade or so.
Really?
Yeah, I missed him, but I've met a bunch of people that worked with him.
Huh. Have you ever heard of this singer Guy Forsyth? No.
I've heard the name. I don't.
Yeah, he's an Austin singer. I met him at a Bernie Sanders rally, and he sang what's that old Waylon Jennings tune? But anyway, he super nice guy. It's funny how that goes. In these towns, you get people, they come, they go, and you miss people all the time. But you've got have you gotten a chance to meet what's his name? He's a blind guitar player, Johnny Highland. You gotten a chance to work with him yet?
I've met him.
Yeah.
I haven't really worked with him, but I haven't been. I mean, I did this little bit of sort of R&B.
Right.
Well, I mean, what we did is we went when the neo soul thing was happening. Was like, wait a minute, the real guys are available,
yeah.
and so we got off we had this rhythm section that was, it was Babbitt and Green.
Oh.
And our lead guitar was Reggie Young.
Oh.
And we had a couple different piano players. And we managed to get Dave Hungate to play rhythm guitar.
Oh, man.
And he was the baddest ass rhythm guitar player in Nashville. Only he doesn't admit to it, and he's a bass player.
Yeah. It's funny how bass players can do that.
But anyway, this thing sounded like a locomotive. It was like Philly and Memphis and Muscle Shoals and Detroit all in one crazy combination. And it was amazing. But then unfortunately, we got as far as the American labels didn't get it. They thought they didn't think it sounded funky enough.
Okay.
European labels got it. And we got a deal lined up with Universal for all of Europe, and then our singer freaked out.
Yeah.
And I had forgotten about that syndrome, that when you take all of somebody's excuses away,
and you say, here it is,
some of them can't handle it. And
I call it addicted to success, or allergic to success. Some people are just allergic to success.
And I had seen that before and didn't want to see it here. And so anyhow, we wound up not able to do anything with it. But
we got to figure out a way. Take the singer off, put out the instrumentals.
Well, a friend of mine is working on getting a singer and getting something happening in London.
Okay.
And I mean, to me, it's like there are many reasons to just forget about the U.S. for the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, radio is useless.
Yes.
Have you seen in my forum on the Womb forums? Have you looked at that?
I'm not on it. I'm actually not on Womb. I should join because Mixer Man.
Well, you don't
can't
have to
even get
join, but I mean, you can look in there.
Yeah, I should go. You're spending a lot more because I know I don't see you on Gear Sluts anymore. So you're spending more time
Yeah,
on
you
it more.
see me now and then, and I'm not doing that much on. There isn't that much happening at Womb because Mixer Man isn't around that much. Seraphim isn't around that much, and
He's a busy guy still. He's really
well, he
crazy
moved
busy.
into Asheville.
Yeah, and I'm like, when are you gonna do something with Moog? Because
And,
Moog is right there. It just seems like a good fit. But
well, he's mostly working with singers and.
yep, yep. And he wrote the. Did you read his new book, The Billionaire Apparent?
Yeah.
I thought that
Well,
was so funny.
I haven't read it. I have the audiobook.
You have the audiobook? Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't heard the audiobook. I read it. Yeah, you're right. Right now, what I try to do with this, I'm in that early stage, right? I've got 6 artists on the label. We're just small. We're just focusing on making good music. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, I think
I'm curious what Barry Gordy was like. Did you get to work with him much?
not much.
Okay.
Not much. He was primarily wheeling and dealing for the artists, and then he moved to LA in like '68, something like that,
Okay.
because everything else had moved to LA. So he basically had to run. And they had set up they had a writer's office and studio in LA beginning in 63, 62.
Oh wow. Yeah, that's pretty early in the history of Motown. Yeah.
Somewhere. And he went right to there. He had an office here in Nashville too,
Oh, okay.
and an office in New York.
Well, it's a good way of doing it. Then you can at least harvest the best songs.
Well,
from
it was
all
a,
over
it
the
was a
country.
publishing company,
Yeah.
and that was where he had to be to pitch songs.
Right.
And they would record their own demos in New York and L.A. because you couldn't hand somebody a Funk Brothers track.
Right. Oh, so and then the Funk Brothers would re-record the underneath.
No, the Funk Brothers would be for the records,
Gotcha. I get you.
and they would hire session musicians in New York and L.A. for the demos.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, Motown.
So
had more number
that's
one.
and a lot of the musicians were very confused because the way you did demos back then was 6 of them in 3 hours.
Really.
Yeah,
6 tunes,
And-
3 hours, 30 minutes a tune. Ooh.
yeah, and
That
they
is-
and they would be doing maybe 3 of those sessions in one day.
For 9 hours.
Yeah, and they couldn't
Yeah.
tell you what any of that stuff was. It was like just spit it out and go.
Spit it out, move on to the next track.
And that's why you have these people claiming they played on Motown records.
Really? I've never heard anybody erroneously claim it.
And what they played on was demos.
Yeah.
Oh, Bernard Purdy has. Carol Kay's the most notorious. And,
Oh, okay.
and they think it is because they did this song, and half the time it's because the name of the song is on a list they had. They couldn't tell you how the song went to save their life. But,
Right. They're all just reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were just reading the stuff through, and they were trying to do it in a different. Usually a publisher has somebody they're aiming a demo at.
Yeah. That's the thing I've learned. Because I'm not super big on the songwriting side of things. I just kind of let the artists write what they're going to write. But yeah, everything I hear coming out of people that pitch songs for a living is they really go target an audit. For the demo, they'll really target an artist specifically.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Exactly.
Hire sound-alike singers and stuff. That's
And that's why they were recording demos of all the stuff, because what Barry was looking for was cuts and publishing income.
Right. And that's historically in music, that's where the money is in writing something.
Yeah.
My band teacher in high school, his dad had written something, I think it was a Ray Charles B-side, and it was like I don't know if it paid for Mr. Randolph's college or something, but it, you know what I mean? It was a lifestyle changing amount of money for them. And I find that I've always found the history of it to be so thoroughly interesting. I'm just curious how, so in the Motown days you get 16 tracks. Did you have 16 channels on the board, or were you doing live summing down to the 16? Or, I mean, how many microphones would you run on these big
Well, we were
sessions?
still pretty primitive. Our big studio, which was the old Golden World Record studio, if I remember right, had 14 inputs that had equalizers and everything, and then they'd sort of tacked on another couple.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And
so that you could bring the machine up on the board, but they were primarily looking at that room for tracking, and they had a 16 input monitor mixer. And
yeah, so because a lot of the sessions would have 2 drummers, a bass player. You said at least 3 guitar players.
But at Studio A, that was a setup, and the board was there was a 6 input board.
6.
Yeah.
Okay. Where do you put your? So
6,
when you're recording a whole band like that, where do you put? 6
and then there was an 8 input board that was sort of homebrew mic preamps that they'd use for the drums.
Okay.
And then there was an Ampex mixer, and there was an old Altic mixer.
Okay.
So the guitars typically went into the Altic mixer.
Okay.
And the bass was by itself, God knows what.
Some box.
It was, well, they had built, see, the studio was so small they couldn't really easily get 3 guitar players and a bass player's amps in.
Right.
So they built 1 amp for everybody.
Really?
That had, what was it, 5 inputs, something like that. It was like a little mixer, and each musician would plug in, and there was a volume control for each of them. And that fed a Macintosh power amp and an Altic studio monitor that sat underneath it.
And they would just plug in DI and then record a speaker.
So they would plug in, and they'd be listening to that speaker.
Yeah.
And the DIs would all come up in the control room, and the guitars would go to this Altic mixer, and the bass, I forget. What the hell did we use for that? Maybe 1 channel of the Altic mixer, of the Altic, of the 6 input board.
So all those guitars on those records were functionally a DI signal then?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that blows. But then you get the room bleed because you got the speaker drive in the room.
Well, you got some room bleed, and the most important thing is you've got the speaker to finger feedback loop going.
Yeah.
Because a bass, a player will sound completely different if they're listening to an amp, but you're taking a DI and recording it. So if they're listening to an amp, you basically got to mic the amp.
Right. Because guitar amplifiers change the sound really drastically.
But if they're listening to a studio monitor,
sounds good. Sounds good to you. Sounds good to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't fully understand that till I came back here. I was working with Babbitt, and he came over and he said, "How in the hell did you guys get that sound?"
Yeah.
And I knew we hadn't done anything to it. I mean, it literally came out of his fingers.
Right.
And so we did some experimenting. We figured out, well, it was just the speakers.
Right, because the speaker, a studio monitor for, now granted, I'm sure some of the people watching the video at this point, they've been watching for the history, but a studio monitor speaker is designed to reproduce every frequency at the same level, ideally. None of them ever do it perfectly, but the ideal is a flat, even response. Guitar speakers and bass speakers, they're very, very colored. They boost certain frequencies and can't produce other frequencies. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what happens is that alters the player's touch.
Yeah. Yeah, and it certainly changes the way you.
and how they set the tone control on the instrument and the whole thing.
Right.
So you basically that ear to finger feedback loop turns out to be absolutely critical.
Yeah, that's yeah, and
So that was a very interesting discovery.
yeah, that's pretty cool. I didn't realize that. I had just assumed they all had like fenders that they were sitting on or something, but yeah, it's a single. It was just all DI. What?
Yeah. And it also because they were playing to their own balance out of the one speaker.
Yeah, which
It
is
was
why
very easy to mix.
Yeah, so you would actually take all the three different DIs independently up into the board. You weren't taking them into a
Well,
single channel.
we were taking them into an Altic mixer.
Right, and then it comes out
Just
of the
do a
mixer.
little bass and treble with the Altic mixer, and that would go to a track.
Yeah, that makes sense. What was the tape machine you guys ran?
It's MM1000 Ampex,
It's an Ampex MM1000. That's a 2-inch or a 1-inch machine?
2-inch.
2-inch. Man, those are some big tapes.
Yeah, these were. We had one in each studio, and then we had two down where the two mix rooms are.
Yeah.
So we could make copies down there. So we had 4 of them, and it was 4 of the first 10 of those mixers ever made.
That's a. Now, did that have Dolby? Did it have the Dolby? No.
Nope.
Because
this was before Dolby.
Okay.
And at one point, we actually did some tests and figured out that DBX worked better than Dolby.
I loved this 688 of mine's got DBX. I really like the sound of Dolby S, but I actually prefer the DBX.
And although the irony is that DBX made this deal with Tascam.
Yep.
And the deal with it is that you've got to have absolutely ruler flat playback, or the DBX goes all over the place.
Yep.
And so DBX with a really flat machine is wonderful. You know, the Studer or something, it's incredible. But with the typical Tascam 8-track, it's horrible.
I don't know that I'd call it horrible. You know, you got to remember, I have a 1/4-inch machine, but I have a low end 1/4-inch machine. I've always been the guy. I've built a very low end room, right? And I do the digital thing, but I have an M2516, so also a Tascam board. I will tell you this: the mixer on the 688 is awful, but the M2516 sounds good, and it's a pretty clean recording. There's a little bit of noise but less crosstalk than you'd think. I was astonished when I first listened back. I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting that good a performance. 4-track you expect that kind of performance, but 8, no. But Yamaha, I don't know. When this thing came out, this thing would have come out in 1992, and 1992 was when you were still in San Francisco, right?
Yeah.
What were you recording to in 1992?
MCI 24-track.
Yeah. So that's why this thing's junk to you, because nothing sounds like an MCI 24-track. But
yeah, well, actually, we had a 1-inch 16-track Tascam before that.
Yeah, I would love
and
those.
We had learned. I mean, the main thing is they've got no headroom.
Yeah, you have to hit them real hard.
So, no, you have to hit them real low.
Oh, see, I just hit everything hard. Maybe I'm doing everything wrong.
No, you have to, and that's the problem with most digital stuff.
Yeah, well, with digital, you gotta.
The analog stages are crap.
Yeah.
And so you have to really watch the levels. And I mean, with digital stuff, I try to peak at about -10.
That makes sense. Have you tried Radar? Have you run Radar, or do you just run Pro Tools?
I've played with it.
Yeah, I've been.
They have decent power. They have decent line amps, which most stuff doesn't have.
Yeah, that's what's interesting to me with them.
But I'm not that crazy about the results. So
Okay, because I'm gonna talk to them. I'm curious. I'm curious to see what they're gonna. I would love to get my hands on one. For me, that would be a better portable rig than this 40-pound Porta Studio. Plus, I don't like the way those preamps sound.
well, have you seen the Jokos?
The what?
It's an English company called Joko,
Okay.
and they make a little recorder for, oh God, the company started by the guy that created Sadie.
Okay. Yep. And Sadie, I believe, is they were a hard drive company.
And this thing records 2 hard drives,
Okay.
and I think it's at least 24 channels, maybe more.
That sounds right up my alley.
And it's designed to record live shows.
But what's it go for? It's got to be that even the base radar system's expensive.
I think it's less than
Really? I'm gonna have to look into it. Yeah, my whole thing. Zoom makes one that's very interesting to me now. They make one that's got 8 XLRs with Phantom in, and the preamps sound pretty good. Like, you know how Zoom is. They're either great or they're terrible. And this one looks like it's one of their better ones.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I find
That's
it
what I
funny.
always heard about Peavey.
What's that?
That's what I always heard about Peavey.
Is that it's either great or terrible? That's exactly it with PV.
And never anything in between.
Never in between. Everything. I have this PV PA that I bought from a guy for like $200. It's my I need to play this 100-person room and they don't have a sound system at all. How do I do this as cheap as possible? And I run it. It's very dark sounding, right? But then you get your hands on an old PV tube amp and you're like, this is amazing. It's amazing how some of these companies get really hit and miss. Have you ever put? I doubt you've ever even put your hands on anything with the word Behringer on it.
Nope.
I don't blame you. You have all the fun toys. What is your are you running System 3000 for your mastering rig these days, or what are you running?
Well, I go back and forth between running Pro Tools and running Samplitude.
Yeah.
And primarily, more and more, I'm using almost all plugins.
Yeah. I mean,
they've come a long way.
It helps when there's a revision needed. You can call it up.
Well, that's the name of the game.
Yeah, because you still do the... Like, I went a different way with my model. I said instead of trying to charge by the hour, because I was getting gigs, but not enough to live on, right? And I said, well, how about instead of me trying to go hustle up a couple of gigs a month, how about I just pick and choose, record for free, and take a cut of the sale? And then that led me to actually learn how to do manufacturing. But because we were talking about vinyl, so you don't have a lathe these days. You don't I bet if we could find you access to a lathe, I bet you could do. There's a big demand for cut.
Well, I could do it, but the problem is, I mean, there's just so much to it, and most of the people aren't really equipped to do it well.
Yeah, what I would love to do is have you teach.
I mean, just lacquer aging alone is a can of worms, and I don't know. We're going to have an AES tour of Welcome to 1979, and we're supposed to see their plating setup, which is interesting. I don't know, but that building, I know when we moved to Nashville, they were doing tape duplicating in that building.
Yeah.
So it may be that they used to do record pressing in there.
Yeah, that's what I watched Sound on Sound did a good documentary on them, and yeah, they said they used to be a vinyl plant. And you were telling me a lot of vinyl plants became.
Well,
CD.
that's how they can get away with it then, because
they're grandfathered in.
They're grandfathered in.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's the part I'm still trying to figure out, because I'm pretty sure with enough research I could figure out how to build a lathe, right? Or because good luck procuring one. Where did they all go? That's what I can't figure out. There used to be lathes all over this country, and now you can't find a vinyl lathe.
Most of the ones in Nashville went to Europe.
They went to Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a German company making a new one, so hopefully I can get my hands on one of those. But because I would love to do vinyl, but on that documentary, the guy who started Welcome to 1979, he said with acetate, their whole thing is they want to plate it as soon as it's cut. Like, all right,
Yeah.
the needle comes up into the plating, it goes, because he said it's like how do you describe it? A footprint in the sand.
Yeah.
Like you stick your foot in the, because it's a soft material, so you stick your foot in the sand.
Oh yeah. Well, ideally you want to have it pretty darn quick.
Yeah. Where.
I mean, typical in the old days was a drive across town or something.
But it would be same day.
But it would be same day, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I still believe, we're gonna. I take a bit of a long view and think about because American music and the culture of America will one day, long after we're all dead, it'll be studied like the Egyptians or the Romans, right? And the question is, how are any of these MP3s going to survive? But somebody will dig a vinyl record out of the ground, because those, I don't even think they biodegrade. So, from an archival standpoint, in your opinion, what's the archival method these days? What's the best way to archive it for future proof? Probably the stamper. The stamper's probably the most likely to survive.
Yeah, well, in a way, although the digital stuff, they've pretty much got it down now to where they're constantly making copies. And
yeah, that's true.
And the solid state drives are getting better, and from an archival standpoint, they've actually probably got a lot going for them.
Yeah, because that's why I do tape. I do tape for archival purposes.
Because there's no moving parts.
Yeah, but isn't a solid state drive, don't they all have to have a battery in them? Solid state drives have a pretty high failure rate. Oh, it's not that way anymore?
No.
Because I remember that on the old thumb drives, they would the battery would go.
That's different technology.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, they're getting there. The only real problem with them is that if anything goes wrong and your computer hoses it, you can't recover it. Whereas with a spinner, you can.
Right.
So most people are still doing any kind of serious work on mechanical drives just as a safety factor. But for something that you're going to record the audio on and store, the solid state's probably better at this point. And it's a problem that they're working through.
Yeah. So you're clearly in the camp that when digital, I guess digital I started recording myself in 1998 with digital, but by then digital was everywhere, wasn't it? Or when did that really flip over for you?
Well, I think the first thing was people started mixing off 16 and 24 track to DAT machines. Well,
yeah.
And that actually sounded remarkably good.
Yeah.
I mean, I think where the big loss is off the floor.
Yeah, especially on a 2-track. Yep.
So I think the idea of recording to digital and then mixing to tape is kind of mixed results.
I agree with that. Yeah, we just recorded this band. I when it's done, I will totally send it to you as soon as I've got the full show mixed. You get to have a listen, but before I even edit anything, right? Like I'm just doing the whole show, but we had to record it digital, and I thought about that. I thought about running it out to the tape machine, but it's not the same. I'm with you. You got to capture it right to the tape.
Yeah, if you can.
Yeah.
I think basically I mean, there's two places where people screw up digital.
Okay.
The very limited quality analog stages.
Yeah.
The way around that is just keep the levels low.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like a Tascam. Just keep the levels down.
Yep. That's what I do with my machine. I like
Yeah, and
right
I mean,
now I'm coming through the Tascam into my Lucid, but
yeah,
I don't even set the line levels correctly. Like this Tascam is the consumer level, and the other one's the pro, and so I can't hit the ceiling on the thing. It just won't do it.
yeah, yeah. Well, most digital stuff, other than your $5,000 converters, are only really capable of running at -10 style.
Yeah.
And
Well, I don't know. I
the,
can set it on my Motus, but yeah, that
uh,
used to be a thing. It was amazing to
do
me.
some experiments and listen to what happens as you turn the volume up, and you'll find they get shockingly better at lower levels.
Really,
Yeah,
because I spent the whole time learning about MSBs, most significant bits.
yeah.
But I guess that's more of a mastering thing. You want you want the playback to be primarily up in those most significant bit range, or
Well,
if I understood it
I mean,
correctly.
basically, when you're recording 24-bit,
Mm-hmm.
and you have got what 6 times 8 dB more headroom, more foot room.
Which is huge. It's
Yeah,
night and day. Yep.
which is huge. And so there's no reason on God's green earth to be. In fact, in broadcasts now, I think a lot of them don't want it peaking over -6.
Yeah, that's where Final Cut complains at me is -6. Yep.
And so, you don't. It doesn't buy you anything to turn it up louder, and it actually turns out to buy you a lot to keep the level down. And then the other place people screw up is the minute you do any kind of signal processing, gain changes, what have you, the results have to be dithered.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't understand that. And if you don't dither, what happens is this sort of edgy, grainy sound builds up.
Which just for the audience that's uninitiated, dithering is when you add just a hint, just a little bitty hint of
Well,
noise.
you add the absolute minimum to keep the bottom bit toggling,
Yep.
so that the cutoff sounds like noise rather than sounding like a chattering noise gate.
Yeah. That's a good way of describing it. Yep. And
And you have to do it. See, I mean, even a tenth of a dB gain change kicks you out to infinite bit depth.
yeah.
Your hardware will limit you to maybe 80 or maybe 64. But whatever it is, you've got to take it down to 24 or 32 float or what have you. And hopefully developers take care of that on the inside, but in practice, not that many do. In fact, Samplitude is one of very few workstations that actually defaults to doing it properly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And most of them you have to add some kind of a dither plug-in, and in most cases that's a limiter.
Yep.
Even if you're not limiting.
Yeah.
And that gives you 40 samples of delay minimum, and a lot of them more than that.
Okay.
And it's a clumsy thing to deal with, but the difference is that, see, once it gets truncated, you lose a lot of the low-level information that gives it dimension.
Yeah, so that low-level information, we're talking about reverb tails, usually.
Well, yeah, but we're also talking about the sound of the room.
Yeah.
Talking about all the things that make it sound like players in a room as opposed to a bunch of virtual instruments.
Yes. Yep. And yeah, I'm glad I took the time to learn about dither, because it really does. If you're especially when you go from 24
Yeah.
down to 16. It's a
And
super important step.
if it's ever, I mean, I go down to 24 too, because if it's ever been allowed to truncate, all that low level information is lost to the distortion because
Gotcha.
it has 6 to 10 dB of distortion on the bottom when you don't dither.
Gotcha.
When you dither, that comes down to maybe 3 or 4 rather than 6 to 10. And you can hear through the noise to stuff below it.
Yeah, or at least perceive it. Yeah, that's true.
Whereas if it's allowed to distort, that will mask everything out.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
mean, people think I'm crazy because I pontificate about this all the time, but it's like that's where that bad digital sound that people hate, that's where it typically comes from, either overloading the analog stages or not dithering.
There's that. I also think that what happens is these days, what I always point out is digital will let you go to a point of loud that is way beyond what you will ever need.
Yeah.
You can compress it so that the dynamic range is so very, very small and all the way at the very loudest point. And vinyl won't let you do that. The needle will jump right out of the groove if you
Oh
try
yeah.
to do that. So not only are we talking about like best practices while doing these digital things, but there's an artistic side of it where those Motown records, yeah, they were a little louder than everybody else's, but it wasn't
There
silly
was
loud.
no Barry Gordy hated the sound of compressors and limiters,
I don't blame him.
so there was very little on
Yeah.
them. I mean, we had one guy who would mix stereo into a couple LA2As, just barely kissing it. But most of the stuff was mixed with no overall limiting at all.
Right. Well, because a lot of the
Maybe some compression on the vocals. But in that studio where you could work the vocalist farther back, you didn't have the desperate need for limiting.
yeah.
And you would do what little it did need off the floor because you didn't want to pick up hiss later.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the funny part with tape. I'm doing a whole series of stuff on my whole tape experience because admittedly I don't even know how to adjust this machine. Like when you're a kid and you're self-taught, nobody ever showed me how to align a tape machine.
Yeah. Well,
I
the
don't know
other
how to do it on a
the other
cassette.
problem is we don't have new tape of the quality that we used to take for granted.
Are you well? At least in large. At least I agree with that in large format, but I disagree in small format. There's this company out of Missouri, which it's gotten dark and you can't see anything. I get these tapes from this company in Missouri. It's a Type 2 high bias, right? So it's a Type 2 tape, but they call it Chrome Plus, and they claim that it gets a better frequency response and a better dynamic range than your standard BA than your Type 2. Though BASF still makes really good tape.
Okay, well those are cassettes.
Yeah, that's true. And you're not going anywhere near these little guys.
Well, the thing about metal tape is that it self-erases after a certain number of years.
Oh, son of a gun, it does, doesn't it? I'm gonna have to do backups to the ferrite. Okay.
I mean, it was a very interesting. One of the guys on one of the mailing lists used to be with 3M.
Okay.
And he said that's the big gotcha that they never talk about.
So the archival part of it's not so good.
Yeah, and the excitement is that these computer tapes are that.
Oh God, yeah. And
Yeah,
computer
there's
tapes
like
are
going to be a
really
whole
susceptible.
bunch of corporate records that are just going to vanish.
That might be good. It might be good. One of the things that I learned all about the history of the Middle Ages, right? I watched this whole mini series on it. And during the peasant revolts of in England in the Middle Ages, the peasants, yeah, sure, they would go grab the despot and kill him, but mostly what they were doing is, granted, the aristocracy called it looting and plundering and all these things. They would go break into the banks and burn all the records, because they would get stuck in these cycles of debt, and they'd go burn their records, so then they were debt free. So, but yeah, Bob, it's been 2 hours. I normally don't run that long. Thank you for taking the time.
Okay.
I think I'm gonna split this one up into 2 parts. But do you ever make it out to Austin? Are you coming out for South by or anything?
No, I haven't.
You're gonna have to come out and visit.
I've got a few friends there.
You should totally come. It's a neat town. There's a lot of really good musicians. You got to go find them, but they're there. And it's a little cheaper than Nashville. Not a lot cheaper.
Well, Austin is the predecessor of San Francisco.
What do you mean?
The San Francisco rock scene was largely due to a guy named Chet Helms.
Okay.
Who used to run a coffee house music venue at the university there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
And a friend of mine and a couple of girls went down to Mexico and started singing a bunch of Pete Seeger songs, got arrested and deported, and apparently you get dumped off somewhere relatively close to Austin.
Yeah.
And
San
so
Marcos or somewhere, yeah.
And so he hitchhiked into Austin and went to this club, this coffee house, and this is folk music era.
Right.
Well, the manager of the coffee house was this guy, Chet Helms.
Okay.
The waitress was Janis Joplin.
Oh, man.
And they talked them into going with them back to San Francisco.
And then history was
And
made.
Helms stayed, and Joplin's parents freaked out because she was a student. And so she went back to Austin and came back to San Francisco some years later. But basically, Helms helped create a whole scene of house parties.
Okay.
And they had these big old houses in relatively low-cost neighborhoods that you could have 8 or 10 people living in this house.
Yep, they're still over there on the east side. Yep.
8 or 10 singles in San Francisco.
Oh, yeah, we have, I know kind of what you're talking about.
These old Victorian houses.
Yeah.
And so what happened was people who were interested in politics and beatniks and all of that would get together and rent one of these houses for $60 a month. And they could throw a party 1 or 2 nights a month and completely cover all their living expenses.
I think there's
And there was 8 or 10 of these houses doing this.
Huh.
And one thing led to another, and there was a group that did socialist parties in the park called the San Francisco Mime Troupe.
Socialist Party in the government park sounds pretty appropriate.
Yeah.
I think that's funny.
Yeah, they were doing plays.
Oh, okay.
Sort of radical plays. And their manager was this guy named Bill Graham.
Okay, yeah. That's a name that rings a bell.
And a couple of the police were looking for something to arrest some of these guys for, and they caught them with some pot. And several of the actors got arrested. And Graham wanted to do a benefit to get them bailed out. Went to the Musicians Union, discovered the Musicians Union only spoke Italian.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And told him what he could do of his benefit in no uncertain terms.
Yep.
So a friend of his knew about these house party things and said, well, why don't you get a bunch of these house band? The people who lived in the house would create a band, and then they would play a couple times a month, and high school kids and other people from around town would come to these things and pay $5 to get in, and So anyway, there was like this whole scene, and so somebody suggested he try that, so he called up a bunch of these people, and they put on this benefit at the cheapest venue available in San Francisco that was mostly used for gospel shows a few times a month, called the Fillmore Auditorium.
Oh, the Fillmore. Yeah.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history.
But Chet Helms literally launched, from what I understand, launched most of the folk-oriented, Americana-oriented music scene in Austin.
That was
and then went to San Francisco and did the same thing.
And San Francisco's booming again. There's a lot of really cool stuff coming out of this jacket came from San Francisco. There's things are going on up there. I'm gonna have to go check it out here one of these days.
Yeah, well, all those computer programmers are good customers for
that's
all kinds of stuff. But from what I've gathered, it's still pretty unaffordable.
Yeah, though I have family in Sacramento, I could figure out like that seems to be where like the people who work in San Francisco live, is like the Antioch and Sacramento.
Oh yeah,
and that's a drive. Holy cow, that's a drive.
Yeah, it's an immense drive, and we wound up living in San Rafael up in Marin County.
Yeah.
And they passed this law, and our landlord gave us notice that he was going to move in because he wanted to move back to Italy. He was from Italy.
Okay.
And had been working as a maitre d' in one of the big restaurants. And he wanted to move back to Italy, and if he had paid $30,000 for the house was worth $500,000. And if he moved back into it, he wouldn't have to pay any income tax on the appreciation.
Oh.
He was hoping to retire on that, but that kicked us out, and all of a sudden our rent doubled.
Yeah.
And the next place we lived, the owner was a guy in his 80s, and sooner or later he was going to kick the bucket, and his kids were going to sell everything off. And so it just, at that point, we were looking at moving way out in the country or something. And
then you wound up in the South. Was it a bit of a culture shock for you coming down there?
Nobody's from here.
Yeah, I guess that's true with Nashville too. Yeah.
No, I mean, in the music business.
Yeah.
I mean, they're from all over the world. There's English and a bunch of guys from Record Plant, New York. It's literally a bunch of people from LA. It's
wild.
I mean, it's sort of the last stand of a lot of it. I mean, I'm part of the older generation. The best part about moving here is that I've gotten to know some of the old original A-Team guys. And they all want to know about Motown.
And you were right there.
And so it's real interesting.
That's awesome.
Because what they pulled off here was utterly amazing. They managed to outfox the Suits to a degree that is mind-boggling. And they were in the late 60s, I would say prior to 24 track, they had 16 different studios doing 3 full live sessions a day, 7 days a week. And it was all record work.
That's amazing.
And it was by no means all country.
No.
I mean, all country was being done here, but country was only a small part of what was being done here.
Yeah.
A lot of pop music and just all kinds of stuff. And it's pretty amazing. And nobody knows it. I mean, because I remember we all thought it was all coming from You know, if you were in LA, you thought it was coming from New York, and if you were in New York, you thought it was coming from LA.
Yeah, you just assume it's one or the other, but it's Nashville.
Yeah,
Snuck in out of nowhere.
and the labels weren't talking about it because they could record a lot cheaper here. Simply because the problem back then was you would have a singer come in, and they would have to figure out what key they were going to sing in.
Right, but the
On
Nashville
spot.
numbers.
And the singer was off the road. It was costing the singer a whole shitload of money to record. It was costing, I mean, the label had like a week to make something happen, or actually more like 3 days. I mean, a typical album was recorded and mixed in 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
Back then. And so what happened was the original musicians in Nashville were incredibly skilled at memorizing.
Okay.
So somebody could play them a song, they could work out a head chart and go. And if it turned out the singer was in a bad key for them,
just transpose it.
Yeah, they'd just transpose it on the spot.
Yep.
But there was a guy named Charlie McCoy who became popular playing harmonica on a bunch of stuff. He couldn't keep up with the regular musicians. And so he's the guy that invented the number system so he could keep up with the other guys.
Hey, that's awesome. Yeah, we're gonna have to. That's
But it was
the next
actually,
rabbit hole.
actually about memorizing it. Harold Bradley told me about that. And
Yeah.
he's supposedly working on a book. I don't know if it's ever going to happen. God, I hope so.
Hey, if he wants to come on, I would love to talk to him about it. That would be interesting. Yeah.